Good morning everyone, welcome to our small footprint. My name is Nyssa, and if you are new here, we are a family of 8 who live off-grid in Australia. Today's video is Cowboy Candy. So I've had a lot of questions about this over time because it's not a very common thing in Australia and I use it in a lot of ways throughout my cooking. So I did a video up for how I do it because I had to clean the freezer out, so I had a whole couple of gallon bags of chilies and stuff that had been harvested last year sitting in my freezer. I needed to use them up so that they were out of my freezer before we get fresh ones coming too. So I made up a big batch. We were almost out as well, so that it's good timing. So I make my cowboy candy based on a recipe that I'll put in the show notes. It's a nice simple recipe that you can sort of work with to figure out what you want to do, and we use it in a myriad of ways. So I've tried to cover in the voiceover how we use it and the slightly differing ways that I process it to make it worthwhile, to make it useful for us. Hopefully I've covered everything. I felt like I rambled and went all over the place, so when I go inside and try and put this over the top of the video, we'll see how we go. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments and I will answer them for you. I'll do an update video tomorrow on the gardens and stuff and let you know how everything is going there and all the chickens, and then I will do a planning video in a couple of days. So any further Q&A questions, I'll put a post up or a story up on Instagram. You can ask me there, and I might put a community post here. So any questions that you have that I haven't answered that you want to ask them, and I'll try and cover them in the Q&A when I share the planning for my grocery trip video as well. So thank you for watching, and I will see you again next time, and enjoy your weekend. Bye guys. There are a myriad of recipes for cowboy candy on the internet. I will put one in the show notes that I use as a base recipe. It's sort of what I've used to work from every time I've made it. It's a nice simple recipe, some good instructions. So if you want a written recipe, that one works really well. But there's a lot of variations in the spices that you add or how you prepare it, how you slice it, and all that sort of thing. For me, for how we use it, I like to dice my chilies. So I have a whole range of chilies. These were all in the freezer from last year, so I wanted to clean them out of the freezer before we hit the point where we're going to be getting fresh ones for this year if my garden ever takes off. So there's a mix. There's some Sweet Temptations, some jalapenos, some algae pineapples. There's a couple of small capsicums or bell peppers that didn't grow very far. I think I had a sweet chocolate version plant in there that didn't do very well. I only had one because we're not huge capsicum eaters, but I wanted some for things like salsa and that, even though in the end I ended up using jalapenos for salsa. So this year I've only really germinated jalapenos and the algae pineapples, I think, because they were my main usage ones, if they ever take off in the garden. Anyway, so I wanted to clean out the freezer before we get to having any fresh stuff for this year. So I pulled out these 2 big gallon Ziploc bags and processed them. So I have this nifty plastic dicer thing. It's got a changeable plate inside, and it does have a base to it, but I couldn't find it, and it dices things really well. It is kind of time consuming though, in that you can only sort of dice 1 or 2 at a time because it's just not strong enough to do any more. I have that giant dicer, but it dices things a little too large for this. I need a small dice for this. There's a lot of different ways that people process their chilies or peppers or whatever you want to call them for this dish. Like, a lot of people cut them into rings because they like to eat the rings on things. Some people have them on pizzas and all that sort of thing. We don't tend to use it that way, so I like it diced. So after a bit of dicing with these, I sat there and went, I think I'm just going to use the Thermomix. So in the end, all I did was threw it in the Thermomix and hit turbo a couple of times, and it ended up minced. So it's obviously not anywhere near as pretty as the diced that came out of the little plastic thingy, but I'm not overly concerned about how it looks. The stuff on my shelf is more for eating, not for looking at, so I didn't really get too concerned. So anyway, I used the Thermomix to mince it up slightly rather than dicing it. Not as attractive, but it looks good anyway. The way we use this cowboy candy is in things, not as a condiment as such. I use it in marinades for my chicken thighs. I use it, or any meat. It's great in a marinade for meat. I use it as a flavouring in my mayonnaise, like a little drizzle in my mayonnaise. It's really nice. In the lemon egg yolk pasta dish that I make with sourdough pasta that we really like, a little drizzle in that, it just brings some really good flavour to that too. I use it in my sausage mixes, so when I'm mincing pork for sausages, I regularly put a small amount of this in there. Adds a bit of sweetness, adds a bit of heat, some flavour, and that sort of thing. So having it in a minced way makes it more versatile for the uses that we make of it, because we don't eat it as a topping, we eat it, or a condiment, we eat it in dishes instead of on them, if that makes sense. So the brine on this is quite sweet. It's a fair bit of sugar, and it's basically a extra heavy syrup. I think it's like a 2-to-1 of sugar to water. Now we do a lot of brine for the amount of solids, so I think the recipe that I'm linking says like it's American, so I think it says 3 pounds of peppers to 6 cups of sugar and 3 cups of apple cider vinegar, or 2 cups of apple cider vinegar. I don't know, it's in the comments, but I double or triple it depending on how many peppers I've got, because we use the liquid a lot. So it's a double, it's like an extra heavy sugar syrup realistically, so it's quite thick. You put it in the pot and you want to bring it to a boil, and then down to a simmer for 5 minutes. So when you add the peppers to it, it's going to really thin it out. So don't be shocked by the fact that it's quite a thick, heavy syrup when you're first heating it through, because the adding of the acids from the peppers and things like that is really going to thin this out, like adding anything to a sugar syrup, that it does something similar. So the thickness of it when it starts, it's not going to stay that thick. So you need to bring the syrup on its own up to a boil. Now I used apple cider vinegar, and I used some garlic. As I said, there's a lot of variations in these recipes. You can use a lot of different things. So some people add turmeric, some people add celery seed, I'm sure there's a range of things, but we just add a little bit of garlic because that's how we like it, and I just used garlic powder. You want to simmer the syrup for about 5 minutes to make sure all that sugar is dissolved, and then you want to add the peppers to the syrup, and you're going to bring that back to a boil, so it comes back up to a rolling boil. Turn it straight back down until it's at a simmer, and simmer it for another 5 minutes, and then it's ready to go. So when you've got your jars, I'm using 240ml jars here, so half pints. You can fill them in a variety of different ways. Again, it's another part of this recipe. This recipe is just, it's really up to how you're going to use it. So like if the people who cut them into slices or neat pieces, they tend to use a slotted spoon and fill their jars with solids as much as possible. So they fill the jars up nice and tight with the solids, and then they pour the syrup over it at the end. Because of the way we use it, that doesn't work real well for me. So what ends up happening is I end up with jars full of solids, and then I can all the brine separately, and I use all the brine and get left with jars of solids. So what we decided to do this time is we filled the jars with a ladle instead of a slotted spoon. So each jar is quite wet and liquidy, and that's how we're going to use it, because that's how I like it. It means that each time I use some syrup in something, I'm getting a few little flecks of the peppers as well. It's not going to be overpowering, but it's going to give it some nice heat and some nice sweetness as well, and I'm not going to have jars that I reach for and jars that I don't. So I just filled it with a ladle so that it's sort of evenly liquid to solids ratio, because that's what's going to work for us. It doesn't look as nice in a jar because the colours have blended. Like if I had have sliced them up, you'd have yellow slices and red slices and green slices. It'd be really pretty. Because I've minced them with the Thermomix, even with the dicing, it leaves a lot of colour. Minced with the Thermomix, it's all just green. And because I'm not packing it with solids and pouring liquid over, it's all just liquid. But it's the taste that matters for me, not how it looks. I'm not gifting these. These are for us to use. I did gift some of the nice ones that I made last year, and I don't think anyone was hugely enamoured of it, so I wouldn't go to an effort to give it to them again unless they requested it. So I just filled the jars with a ladle and used a funnel and filled them all up. You want to make sure that you clean the rims really well because this is a sticky sugar syrup, so you want to use vinegar on a clean cloth or paper towel and clean the rims really, really well around the tops and around the sides, and you want to tighten the lids. So I have used lug lid jars as well as some mason jars. Lug lid jars you tighten up firmly before you process, and the mason jars you just fingertip tight the rings so that they've got room in there. I think I ended up with 21 jars all up, or 21 and a half jars all up, which is really good. So this was around about 3 pounds. What I measured it in pounds on my scales because I was trying to compare it to the recipe. So there's 2.2 pounds per kilo of mixed chilies, and then it was 12 cups of sugar and 6 cups of apple cider vinegar, I think, with like 6 teaspoons of garlic. So I followed the general ratios in the recipe that I'm linking anyway, so just use that as a guideline. But it was double the brine to the amount of peppers because we like to use that brine a lot. And I did consider like tripling it and canning a whole lot of the brine in like a sauce jar, but it is only going to be sort of 12 weeks before we have our own coming in again, so I think I'll wait and see what comes in the garden, what I manage to grow, and depending on the quantity that I manage to grow, maybe I'll do that with the next lot, because if I don't get a whole lot then it'll stretch it out until the next time we grow peppers and stuff. So sidetracked there, sorry. So you fill the canner. I did a double layer in my Presto water bath canner. You have to make sure you have a rack in the middle. You need to make sure the water goes to 1.5 inches above the top jar when you're water bath canning, and you want to put the lid on but not sealed when you're using the canner, because you're not getting up to pressure, you're just putting the lid on to stop some splatter and to help get the heat up faster. And once it's at a rolling boil, then you start your timer. These are canned for 10 minutes. If you're under 1,000 feet, we're above 1,000 feet, so it's 15 minutes for us. So 15 minutes at a rolling boil. Once the timer has gone off, we then take the lid off and let it sit for 5 or 10 minutes and then remove the jars. So the jars, as I said, they don't look as pretty as they could because of the way that I canned it with the dicing and the liquid and stuff. They're very green, but they, I suppose if you were only using jalapenos, they'd be green anyway. But the last year's, it did look prettier because it had the bits of yellow and the bits of red and things like that. But because of the way I minced it, it's all just a bit of a mishmash of colour, but it's going to taste really good. So it's best if you can let it age for a couple of weeks on the shelf before you use it. So 4 weeks I think is recommended for letting it sit and age, for the vinegar to mellow a little bit and the flavours to permeate properly and things like that. And then we start using it. So we use it in all those ways that I've already discussed. Mayo, pasta sauces, in sausage mixes, marinating meat, lots of things. We use a fair bit of it. So I hope I covered everything there for you. I feel like I went all over the place with that voiceover, but hopefully I've answered all the questions. If I've missed anything, please ask me in the comments and I will be happy to cover it as well. Thank you for watching, and I will see you again next time.